Welcome, everyone. Today, I will be analyzing Charles W. Chesnutt's 1901 novel, The Marrow of Tradition, through an excerpt that is found in a Norton Critical Edition. And here is my copy. If you have a different one, I strongly recommend this one. In this edition, there are critiques, explanations about historical context, timelines with historical events, propaganda posters, and articles that delve into the aspects of Chesnutt's rich novel. If you get the time, this teaches a lot about history, and it's definitely something I'm going to be revisiting with my own students later. This powerful work tackles themes that remain painfully relevant today, such as realism, racial identity, the vulnerability of children, familial tensions, power dynamics, and the impact of violence on society. Through Ryan Simmons' work, Realism, Tragic Mulatto Violence, which is coming from the simple and complex discourse in the Marrow of Tradition, readers are able to explore how each of these topics is interconnected within Chesnutt's novel. Simmons points out that the novel is fascinating because Chesnutt was writing during a period when literary realism was at its peak. However, many of the authors of that time period are going to shy away from issues that are as strongly divisive as race and violence. Chesnutt is addressing these issues that many white authors of this area are going to either ignore or stereotype. And Simmons helps the readers to understand this overarching question: what makes the Marrow of Tradition such a significant contribution to American realism? Simmons begins his exploration of children, particularly through young Theodore Carteret. And this motif is explored in the novel in the 3 steps that I have over here on the left. So first, we have Dodie's regular childhood infections. Then we have Dodie choking on an object and almost getting his throat sliced open to save him. And finally, his final battle with Croup. And I hate to be spoiling the ending, but that is going to leave a lot of tension and a lot of complexity that are developed in Simmons' article. Narratives about an ailing child, and it uses them to explore the brutal realities of Jim Crow America. Unlike Chesnutt's contemporaries, who often romanticize this antebellum South during the Reconstruction era, Chesnutt presents readers with a portrait of the racial violence and the systemic oppression that he experienced firsthand. One of the other articles in here actually talked about how he went and he interviewed people shortly after the Wilmington massacre. And so I found it really interesting that he actually had cousins in the area as well. And so he got a lot of their accounts, and he had lived in a similar area. So he had a lot of that dialogue that we see embedded in our story. Ryan Simmons argues that Chesnutt uses both simple and complex discourse to reveal how language itself becomes a tool for racial control. One way this nuanced form of language is developed is through the ailments of young Dodie. So in the scene where Dr. Burns realizes an object has moved within the child's throat, it's actually used as an analogy for the topic of racism in the South. So thinking about this child who has this object stuck in his throat, and all of the doctors are prepping him for this very traumatic surgery. And then Dr. Burns says, oh no, all it needs is just a good whack on the back, and he gets the object to come out of his throat. People are preparing for extreme measures, such as the slicing of a child's throat, but with patience and attentiveness, the problem could be fixed with a rough whack on the back. And this kind of culminates with the idea that Simmons is trying to propel. Chesnutt appears to hope, despite his realist methods and his realistic understanding of the nature of power, that the nation's race problem can be corrected with a strong, precisely applied whack on the back. According to Simmons, this is the intended purpose behind publishing The Marrow of Tradition. Did break it apart into smaller steps. So Chesnutt first frames everything through the encounters with the Carterets. Then the article talks about how Southern racists do not fully ascribe to the beliefs that they state. It does give a lot of evidence with that. However, I didn't completely buy into the argument. So this is kind of developed through Burns changing his mind when he hears more personal story behind why Dr. Miller is not admitted into the house. That argument is really underdeveloped in this text. Number 3, he blends race and personal history to make a nuanced assertion. Number 4, Chesnutt had high hopes that the novel would impact politics through intellect. However, it does not hit home the way that he was hoping. Number 5, racism harms both parties involved, and unfortunately this is going to have a spoiler because the end of the story is where you really get the impact of that statement. And number 6, people need to accept their role in the legacy of racism to overcome. And so this is developed through the outspoken beliefs of Dr. Burns. Carteret convinces Burns to operate on his own son by making the matter both more and less complex. More so because what Burns had originally regarded as a straightforward matter of racism is now explained to be about both race and personal history. And so pulling this information to really talk about how our author is urging readers to open their eyes to the violence that is occurring in antebellum South. And he's trying to use subtle hints to try to get us to that end. That really occurs the most in the end scene of the novel. He's trying to highlight how racism really is not going to benefit anyone. And people need to accept that by not speaking out, they are playing a role in those racist tendencies continuing. Simmons points out that racism cannot be exposed directly and addressed en masse because the power dynamics are layered and very difficult to control. He claims that Chesnutt saw the oversimplification of alleviating the curse of racism, and he knew that it would not be an easy fix when it goes into the habits and histories that are so established. The most complex themes in the novel is going to be racial identity, particularly through the mixed race figure of Janet Miller. And Janet kind of subverts the idea of the tragic mulatto. I actually had to look up that motif to really completely understand it. But it's the idea that the person will always suffer because they are cursed to be part of one race and part of another, but excluded from both races. And so Janet is actually a fully realized character rather than just a mere symbol of racial mixing. She's educated, she's dignified, she's married to the town's doctor, Dr. Miller. Simmons is going to relate how the novel navigates through different counter arguments from white Southerners through the dialogue between characters like Janet Miller and her half-sister, Mrs. Carteret. He uses this dialogue to highlight misconceptions and how propaganda was employed to perpetuate them. Burns and his reconsideration of his position when he is talking to Major Carteret is a prime example of that. So the author goes on to discuss how he wants us to understand the complex navigation of dealing with these Southern white racist supremacists. And so that I pulled from page 491, they have managed to negotiate complex and simple answers to their antagonist objections quite aptly as it suits them. And so Chesnutt wants his anti-racist advocates to have the same flexibility and sway over their audience. And so he really develops this idea through both simple and complex discourse. So we have the direct addresses where he is saying, hey, this is wrong. We have him condemning the idea of a lynch mob, and we have the moral highlights of our specific character actions where we get kind of inner workings of what each character is doing. But then the complex discourse is going to be the use of irony to expose the contradictions. So white racists don't fully ascribe to everything that they are putting out. Because of their history and because of their habits, they're going to keep those traditions going. And so he does try to build in a little bit of balance when he develops those characters as well. So Chesnutt challenges the tragic mulatto stereotype by refusing to make Janet's mixed heritage the source of her suffering. Instead, her pain is going to come from a society that has a very racist structure. So this connects directly to the novel's treatment of violence, which operates on a lot of different levels. There is violence in the riot itself. There is violence in the interactions between characters, especially when we have the mislabeled violence against someone who has been murdered and supposedly robbed. Overall, the novel is showing how structural violence creates the conditions for explosive physical violence. Chesnutt understands that realism can cause transformation, but it has to be accepted and analyzed by the public through the lens of how the social world needs to improve. This is followed by an explanation of how Chesnutt's novel did not sell well, because the white audience was not ready to accept their own roles in the horrific violence still occurring in the South. Chesnutt was received with harsh criticism, and many called him out as not being as subtle as he had seemed. They actually go on to call him bitter for some of the statements that he made within the novel. Many critics called out the book as having one-to-many psychological reasoning behind why some of the characters acted the way they did. One example of this is described in the analysis section about McBain's appeal to Tom. And so by conveying the rationale behind these villainous characters, Chesnutt creates a sense of balance between their choices and the reasons that they are acting in this manner. So he's wanting to get the readers to understand this intellectual thought process. So riot scenes show their calculated nature behind the propaganda. And the white supremacists aren't acting from passion. They're actually implementing a systematic approach to shut down the white businesses and the Black political power. And so characters like Captain McBain are going to represent the organization of this violence. Simmons describes this complex navigation of racist Southerners here. They manage to negotiate complex and simple answers to their antagonist objectives quite aptly as it suits them. And Chesnutt wants his anti-racist advocates to have this flexibility and continue on. He presses them to advocate for change. And the novel's ending is going to develop many complexities, both with the simple discourse and the complex discourse. And when it makes that final decision, which I'm trying not to spoil for you guys, it really drives home a lot of things that our author is going to be criticized about. So why should the Black woman be the one who forgives and decides to turn the other cheek? However, a lot of people pointed out that maybe it was just the idea that Chesnutt is wanting to stop this cycle of violence, and he is exploring possibilities on ways to do this. And so if he is successful or if he is not successful could be based on the time period when it was written. But it is still a very relevant novel today because it reveals all of the deep roots of racial conflict. And Chesnutt is showing us how a post-Reconstruction backlash established patterns of systemic issues that we have in American society today. So as Simmons puts it, the inveterate nature of racism is central to the novel. As the narrator remarks, the habits and customs of a people were not to be changed in a day, nor by the stroke of a pen. The novel's realism helps readers to understand that these aren't aberrations. They are features of American society that require vigilance to combat. And that is the message I am leaving you with. Thank you guys. Have a great day.